Good afternoon to you. I'm tempted to say we're moving from the esoteric to the practical with my lecture, but as a theologian, of course, I'm well aware that of the vital and practical and life-giving nature of our theology. Nevertheless, I'm addressing specifically this afternoon the question of abuse, abusive leadership within the Christian church. I'd like to begin my paper with a brief summary of the context from which I'm speaking to you. In the last decade or so, what many call the West has been besieged by a succession of scandals relating to those in authority. In the past, such abuse has been tolerated by those who felt vulnerable and powerless, and they may even have been told they had to tolerate abuse. It was their duty. However, the current scandals reflect a growing, strong, even fierce reluctance to allow such abuse to continue. As a result, an increasing number of agencies, politicians, business leaders, and other public figures, even royalty, have been disgraced by those who have come forward to witness to their own experience of abuse. This abuse has often been physical, frequently sexual, but also includes a variety of forms of bullying and coercion, which can be physical, psychological, and spiritual. And I mention the last category of spiritual since several high-profile cases have been abuse by church leaders, not least, but not exclusively, those within the evangelical churches or organizations with which I personally identify. Quite apart from more prominent cases, I myself have on several occasions been subject to abuse by Christians in position of power, and my health has suffered and still suffers as a consequence. I've also found myself having to pastorally support others who've been subject to quite appalling abuse by individuals and groups of allegedly fellow Christians. So my interest in this topic today is not merely theoretical. I'm only too aware of the pain, the suffering, the feelings of guilt, worthlessness, and despair that such abuse causes, including, I am sure, some of you here today. Indeed, my reason for giving this paper in Tbilisi is that church life in Central and Eastern Europe, not least the Caucasus, has provided me with ample evidence to believe that the West is not an exception, but conforms to a universal rule. Simply put, Christians in authority worldwide often appear to abuse their authority and victimize those for whom they've been given a God-given duty of care as shepherds. So in this paper, I'd like to explore why abuse is so endemic within churches, especially church leadership, and offer some practical recommendations. But first, I want to draw your attention to the fact that to speak about abuse of power by Christians in position of authority contradicts the teaching of the gospel and the practice of the early church. Put simply, it's a denial of the ethics of the kingdom of God. I have in mind especially Mark 8, 42 to 45, where we read, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it'll be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came to not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Thus, Jesus made it very clear that true leadership is characterized by serving others, not, as he says, adopting secular standards and lording it over those for whom leaders are responsible. Jesus also makes this affirmation in the context of his own self-denying, self-giving ministry. The implication is that we might expect abuse in the secular world, but not within the church. The conduct of the earliest Christian leaders appears to have corresponded with the teaching and example of Jesus. For example, Peter was well aware of his apostleship, as is clear from 1 Peter 1 verse 1, but he identifies himself as a fellow elder in 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 1, recognizing that responsibility does not involve lording it over those for whom he's been given pastoral care. Then in 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 1, Peter again refers to his apostleship, but he adds the corollary that such made him a slave. Finally, he concludes the same letter by referring to his readers as his dear friends in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 17. Similarly, John could speak of himself as your brother in Revelation chapter 1 verse 9 and refer to those for whom he was responsible with affection, my dear children, in 1 John 2, 1 and elsewhere. And very simply, he refers to himself as the elder in 2 John verse 1. James, the leader of the early church, and his brother Jude, both in my view, half-siblings of Jesus, but we can leave that debate for another day, refer to themselves as servants, James 1:1 and Jude 1. So did Paul, Romans 1:1 and elsewhere, and I'll return to Paul. All these apostolic leaders of the early church recognized the call to servitude to Jesus and recognized the exemplary nature of Jesus' own ministry. It's therefore no surprise that they echo Jesus' words so often. Tragically, such self-giving, self-denying, humble service of others for Jesus' sake and according to his example is scarcely one that prevails in the church today. The question is, therefore, why? I would like to offer to you 3 reasons for such abuse. We could doubtless come up with others, and lying back at all of these is the question of human sin, but I'm not going to address that specific question today. So the first reason, the influence of history. From the 4th century onwards, both the Western and the Eastern churches found themselves inextricably caught up with the political life of their respective spheres. Something's often little changed today. There was and is, of course, a positive side to this. Society was and is undoubtedly leavened by the church's presence. There was, however, a downside. The structures of the church and the expectations of its leaders became those shaped by the prevailing secular culture and its hierarchy of authorities and power games. Almost from that point on, we can trace in every branch of the Christian church a split. On the one hand, there were those who viewed the church as a career and a means to authority and power. On the other were those who distanced themselves from secular society so as to live gospel-inspired lives. And we can think back as far as the Desert Fathers. However, the outcome is that still today the church often copies the authority structures of secular power and authority. A career in the church remains a pathway to honour and power, and sadly too many Christians have bought the lie and think that this is how leadership in the church should be exercised. Abuse is therefore inevitable, since power corrupts. Consequently, both individuals and institutions conduct themselves as lords, not servants, inevitably leading a trail of destruction and ruined lives in their wake. So our historical context. Secondly, our social context. My point here is a slightly different one. Our current social contexts are shaped by our own culture and recent histories. The more I travel, the more I recognize that we are all shaped, sometimes indeed perhaps inevitably more than we realize, by the world in which we've been brought up. What we've come to regard as normal is often simply a reflection of the customary values and practices of our own cultures and subcultures. And some of these things we regard as normal are destructive of who we are. Almost always this involves abuse by those in power, and frequently our acquiescence in such abuse because of its apparent normality. In my own context in the United Kingdom, we have traditionally been taught by our elders, of course, to regard them as our elders and betters. This has been accompanied by the fact that, especially in the churches, many leaders have been educated in elite schools and in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. As a result, an elite group of often self-serving individuals and institutions have been created. Can I say, I think I can justify my criticisms as a Cambridge graduate. But all too often we've accepted the propaganda that the elite have circulated, and it's become our worldview. Consequently, we've accepted abuse by the elite and not even recognised that we're being dehumanised by them. Happily, this situation is changing, and as the English phrase expresses it, the worm has turned. But now to the Caucasus. I've been travelling in the part of Europe that was formerly dominated by the Soviet Union for about 35 years. One thing stands out. Many of these countries are still infected, and I deliberately use that word, by a worldview that's been parented by those years under Soviet domination and probably grandparented by Tsarist Russia. Leadership, therefore, must be strong and authoritarian, whatever the cost to those over whom such authority is exercised. Thus, all too often, to aspire to leadership is to aspire to being a bully whose agenda is self-driven and to whom others must be subservient. If Vladimir Putin must be strong, so often we think should our pastors and our leaders be autocrats, and we must submit to their rule or face the painful consequences. However, whether it's in the United Kingdom or the Caucasus, we need to grasp, and our leaders need to grasp, that this is not the ministry and servanthood that characterized Jesus and the early leaders of the Christian church. Rather, it's an anti-Christian model that lords it over others and abuses and dehumanizes those for whom they've been called to serve. I cannot express myself more strongly my belief that the painful divisions so characteristic of churches and congregations in the West and in the Caucasus are the result to a very great extent of such sinful abuse by false shepherds. These leave a trail of destruction and damaged lives in their wake. Very simply, such leadership, I suggest, knows little or nothing of the Spirit of Christ. But there's a third factor, the historical, the social, and then issues of personal character. I noted that the church history reveals that in almost every generation there are those who sought to walk humbly before their God. Many of these women and men we now regard as saints. They're lasting examples of how we too should live. But the same history reveals there has almost always been another group. These have regarded advancement in the church as a route to power and authority. But how, in the light of Jesus' teaching, can that be true? Various answers might be given, but I want to focus on just one as we begin to draw to a conclusion. Recent studies, especially in the United States of America, have revealed that very many Christian leaders reveal a tendency to a sociopathic or a narcissistic character trait. Now, a sociopath has been described as, and I quote, characterized by a limited capacity for empathy and a long-term pattern of disregard or violation of the rights of others. This personality trait or disorder often includes, quote, a lack of remorse after hurting others, deceitfulness, irresponsibility, and aggressive behavior. I end quote. A narcissistic personality disorder is, again I'm quoting, characterized by a fragile sense of self that becomes a view of oneself as exceptional. It's a personality disorder characterized by a lifelong pattern of exaggerated feelings of self-importance, an excessive need for admiration, a delusional sense of status, a diminished ability or unwillingness to empathize with others' feelings, and an interpersonal exploitive behavior. Again, I end quote. And these two traits are often linked one with the other. Now, I'm not here concerned about the various factors that psychologists apportion to the origins of these disorders. However, in simply listing these symptoms, I'm aware how often I've encountered people characterized by such traits in Christian leadership, almost always to my or other people's loss. Perhaps some of you too were surprised by how accurately these traits describe leaders that you know too, and only too well. How then can we explain the prevalence of such persons in Christian leadership? In my experience, two things stand out from the descriptions given above. The first is the reference to deceitfulness, and the second to exploitative behavior. In my view, they come together in the person who presents themselves as amiable, charming, and they mask themselves, especially before those whose approval they need to gain or retain. Meanwhile, however, they abuse those whose approval they do not need. And tragically, in my experience, it is their very winsomeness with those they need to influence that means that when people complain about their conduct, their peers do not believe that they can possibly conduct themselves in that sort of way. And the peers, therefore, become part of a system that perpetrates abuse and marginalizes and even criticizes those who've made complaints of abuse. So to my concluding reflections. I've attempted in this short address to compare the experience we often have of authorities in the churches and Christian organizations with the example and teaching of Jesus and the early disciples. There is sometimes and very evidently a huge gulf between gospel teaching and practice and the leaders under whom we are so often called to suffer, literally. How should we respond? First of all, I think we need to open our Bibles. We need to allow ourselves, as in everything, to have our worldview and practice shaped by kingdom values. In this case, we need it to shape our understanding of authority within the church as that of those who serve as Jesus did. Secondly, in connection with this, we need to have a hard look at the historical and cultural factors that have shaped our worldview and practice, and reject those elements which run contrary to the gospel. Thirdly, individually, if we're ambitious for authority or see others who are, I think that often disqualifies us from Christian leadership. But if we have a heart to serve others or again see that in others, we may be being prepared for such leadership. However, with leadership comes the tendency to slip into worldly attitudes and practices. To avoid this regular self-examination, and individuals and groups of peers to whom we are accountable are invaluable, even essential. I've certainly valued such people myself. Fourthly, we should be alert to damaging character traits in ourselves and others. Not all such traits disqualify from leadership, but they must be monitored. As I look back over the years, I realize that, for example, the masks of sociopaths and narcissists that I have known did on occasion slip. This is almost inevitable. We cannot live a life of pretense 24/7. However, we tend to be charitable. We make allowances for the faults of others, as we should, because we know we're not perfect, but in doing so, we can often allow the abuser space to continue to abuse us and others, and to strengthen their power base. In my experience, we should give greater recognition to those moments when the mask slipped and we glimpsed something of the real person behind the mask. Fifthly, We should not be coerced into believing abusive leadership is okay. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 20, Paul recognized the temptation of spiritual men and women to be coerced into believing the narrative given us by abusive false shepherds. He uses extremely strong language to describe those who apparently willingly suffer abuse. He refers to this as a form of slavery and to the propaganda of those who promote themselves while emotionally and physically abusing their disciples, devouring them, he says, to achieve their own ends. Finally, I address those who've suffered abuse. The first thing you need to know is that you're not alone. Secondly, when suffering abuse or coming to terms with it, you need faithful, understanding friends and supporters with whom you can openly share your pain and prayerfully help you work through it. It's not wise to face abuse alone, as the abuser will almost always find ways to control the situation to their advantage. Thirdly, be wise in taking steps to expose abuse. Again, this is best not done alone. I'm currently involved in a situation where I'm meeting with church authorities and one other person on behalf of someone who has been systematically abused by those in the highest authority within the UK. It's difficult for the church authorities to ignore the situation when there are witnesses to the discussions that are taking place. Well, at this point I must stop. Much else could have been said, but I must say this one thing in closing. If what I've shared reflects your own pain, please speak to a trusted friend or leader. You should not, you must not go forward in agony and distress alone.